Hello, my friends. It's Mrs. Surratt here again to talk to you about the women's right movement. Now, the women's right movement really has to go back before the Civil War to 1848, the Seneca Falls. Remember the Conference of Seneca Falls, which was the first time that women got together to discuss issues that were important to them. And there, a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Seneca Falls Declaration, which was the statement, and it talked about men and women being created as equal. And it's really the first time that anyone kind of publicly brings up the idea of women's suffrage, which a lot of women even were kind of shocked by. Women should vote? What? You know, some people said, I feel more safe with a man taking care of me. But it does get people to kind of start thinking about the idea of women being allowed to vote. And then remember, after the Civil War, they gave African American men the right to vote, and women are sitting here saying, wait a minute, what about us? Why aren't we getting the right to vote? So this really gains momentum after the Civil War. It picks up again about the 1880s, 1890s. And you can see here, what was the woman's role? Well, according to this commercial here, the woman is sewing, taking care of her family, and she really was seen as being the leader of the domestic sphere. She's in the home. She's providing moral support and upbringing for her children. She's giving her husband this warm, nurturing home. And a lot of women's rights activists were saying, now wait a minute, you know, women can work outside the home a little. It wasn't as common until World War I. And women have been able to kind of lend a voice and be support. Why couldn't women vote? Why can't women be involved in political affairs? So women's rights activists get together and they start trying to figure out, how do we go about getting the vote? And some people want to have the federal government, you know, Washington, D.C., make this decision and then every state is forced. Other places say, well, let's start small. Let's start in our area. Let's start with our state. And then also, what other reforms? You know, do women just need to vote? Are there other reforms that women need? Maybe safeties or protections in working. So there was a lot of disagreement among different camps about how women's rights should be pursued. So I will start with one group who is, well, actually two groups that were kind of going on at about the same time. The National Women's Suffrage Association, apparently very easy for me to say, and the American Women's Suffrage Association. See, it's a tongue twister. The National Women's Suffrage Association was started first, and it features Elizabeth Cady Stanton, writer of that Seneca Falls Declaration, as well as Susan B. Anthony, and they've really been working together for a long time. They kind of got together before the Civil War. And they were a very radical group. I mean, they wanted change and they wanted it now. And they thought that women should be the only ones who are allowed to work for this change. You know, men, you've had your day, you go do your thing, women are going to handle this. They were the ones who were fighting for federal changes. They wanted changes at the Washington, D.C., the federal or national level that would trickle down to all of the states. Their newsletter was called The Revolution. They were a very radical group, and they weren't willing to compromise. They weren't willing to consider anything less than women being fully equal to men. Another group that was started was called the American Women's Suffrage Association. American Women's Suffrage Association, I think that's what I said. And their leaders were Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. And they were a lot less radical. They welcomed men to work alongside them as long as they were working for women's votes. And they appealed to more conservative women. And a lot of women, this was a lot of change. So they kind of eased them into it. And they said, rather than wait for the federal government, let's just work at the state level. Let's get each state to work with us. So you've got these two camps, and they're fighting for the same thing, but they're going about it very differently, and they're not really working together. They're kind of butting heads. But eventually they sort of realize, well, wait a minute, the more we fight with each other, the less we can accomplish anywhere else. So you see a joining of this group, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, also known as NAWSA. So in 1890, NAWSA comes about, and it continues to have this sort of dichotomy. Do we work at the federal level? Do we work at the state level? Until a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt, and here she is right here, who was the president of NAWSA from 1900 to 1904, and then she returned to the presidency again from 1915 to 1920. Remember, she's not president of the United States. She's president of the suffrage movement. She realized that really, guys, we're not going to get anywhere unless we approach each state flexibly. So if we realize that this state is more open to women's rights, but this state isn't, we're going to have some changing tactics. So she comes up with this more state by state strategy. We'll hit this state, then we'll hit this state, then we'll keep working. And she actually gets some serious breakthrough. In the West, the lines separating the women's sphere and the men's sphere are more fuzzy. You know, women are working right next to their husbands. If a husband dies, they're taking over the farm. They're being left in charge to speak for the husband if he has to go somewhere. So they kind of start out in the West and they realize that they're going to have a better chance of getting Western governments to listen to them. And in 1869, Wyoming actually establishes full voting rights for women. They want more women in Wyoming. There was a huge number of men, very few women. So of course men can't get married or have families. Utah and Washington follow them. By 1893, women in Colorado gain the vote. And in 1916, and this is probably one of the most fascinating things to me, in Montana, the voters elected Jeannette Rankin to the U.S. House of Representatives to become the first woman in Congress. Women couldn't vote. But in Montana, they're already electing women leaders before they're even allowed to vote in national elections. So you can see out in the West, there's a really different attitude. Women and men were not seen as separated, with the women in the domestic and the men in the being the workers. They were more equals in the West. And here you can take a look at how women's suffrage was changing state by state. So for example, you can look Wyoming, I can read. Of course, we said was first, 1869, and then you can see other Western states are allowing equal suffrage for women. So notice that the red is the places where women have equal suffrage, meaning they can vote in all elections. Some places gave women the right to vote in certain elections. So Texas, all these golden states. Even up here in Maine, they said, well, women could vote in these kinds of elections, but maybe not that one. And you will notice that New York and Michigan were following suit. Before the all women were given the right to vote, they even jumped in. But some places, New Mexico, Georgia, these green states, no statewide women's suffrage. They might be allowed to vote in local elections, but they are not allowed to vote in the state. Even in Hawaii, they were not allowed to vote. Now we have a very interesting woman. Her name is Alice Paul. And Alice Paul comes along and she creates a national political party to fight for women's suffrage. It was called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, and it later becomes known as the National Woman's Party. And she's pushing for a constitutional amendment. Okay, this is great that some states have given women the right to vote, but that's it. Let's take this to a federal level. So she's kind of supported. It kind of made sense. If you start out and you get some of the states to support you, then you can get the whole country to support you. Alice Paul went to England. And she saw what the women there were doing for the vote, and she learned about these militant but non-violent tactics, meaning that you don't back down, but you don't fight with anybody either. So you might yell, you might kind of, like if a police officer comes up to you and says, hey, you need to leave, you kind of ignore him and you keep yelling, but you don't engage in fisticuffs or any kind of fighting. She actually led a picket line in front of the White House and was not only arrested, but assaulted and beaten. The police officers beat her and the women with her down with sticks to get them to stop yelling, because that's what they would do. They would just keep yelling over the police officers. When she gets to prison, Alice Paul decides to lead a hunger strike, and she refused to eat. And guys, the publicity generated from this was enormous. People were like, oh my gosh, this woman's not going to eat till we get the vote. And I mean, she hasn't been eating in like weeks, and she's starting to get rail thin, and she's just barely drinking enough water to stay alive. And they're like, oh my gosh, if she's this committed, maybe we need to give women the right to vote. Well, they decided to try and stop her, so they actually got a court order to force her to be fed. And it's kind of disgusting, and I apologize, but they put a tube down her throat and they forced food into her body. It was horrible. It was disgusting. And when people heard about this, they were outraged. They demanded the immediate release. And rather than have to face the wrath of the people, they did release them. But when people saw what these women were willing to go for to get the vote, it pretty much turned the tide, and people said, okay, that's it. If women are this committed, they need the vote. So the 19th Amendment, I'm sorry that's kind of a hard color to see. Let me fix that here for you. The 19th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1919. And once an amendment is passed, it doesn't become a law until the states ratify it. So it goes to the states, and in 1920, the states passed it 35, but they really needed 36 because they have to have more than a majority. So it comes down to Tennessee. And there's this legislator, and he's sitting there and he's trying to decide who he should vote for. He's actually kind of a young legislator, and the other men around him are going, no, you're going to vote no, you're going to vote no. But his mother writes in this note and says, oh, do support that nice Carrie Chapman Cat, or actually she calls her Miss Cat. And so he decides for his mom he will support this amendment. And so Tennessee becomes the 36th state, and in August 6, 1920, women are granted the right to vote in all states. So it was a pretty big deal. All right, now it's a little tricky. I mean, remembering which person said what. So I've got a little quiz for you, if you will. I want you to think about if you could answer this question. Who is who? So which person, or I should say, which two people would answer question number 1. More conservative women supported the AWSA led by these women. So think about it. If you need to, you can pause and go back and look. Number 2, didn't want men involved in the fight for votes for women. Who would that be? Number 3, wanted a more flexible state-by-state approach to earning the vote for women. So who is looking for that? And number 4, staged sit-ins, picket lines, and other nonviolent but militant protests to fight for votes for women. So hit pause for just a second and see if you can go back and figure out who these women are. And then I'm going to go on and I'll give you the answers. Go ahead, hit pause. I'll wait. All right, you back? Okay, good. So who is it? Well, number 1, more conservative women supported the AWSA led by Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone. It's important to know that they were the ones who were not as militant. Number 2, didn't want men involved in the fight for women, for votes for women. That would be Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And remember, they've probably been at this a lot longer than anybody else at that time. Number 3, wanted a more flexible state-by-state approach to earning the vote for women. That was Carrie Chapman Catt. She was the one who said, you know, we're not getting anywhere trying to go after the federal government. Let's go after each state individually. And number 4, staged sit-ins, picket lines, and other nonviolent but militant protests to fight for the votes for women. That would be Alice Paul. There are some really great videos out there on YouTube, guys, if you're interested, where you can learn a lot more about women's suffrage, but hopefully this answers some questions for you. So good luck, and I'll talk to you soon.